Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Dae Houlihan, and I'll be talking about how people infer what events elicited others' emotional expressions. And this is work in collaboration with Desmond Ong, Matti Cusimano, and Rebecca Sachs. And I'll start by motivating this work with a recent example. At this year's Academy Awards, there is a televised altercation between Will Smith and Chris Rock that many found shocking. This photo of Nicole Kidman was widely shared on social media in association with the confrontation, but despite how well her expressions seemed to capture the moment, the photo had actually been taken before the televised awards began, when Nicole spotted her friend Jessica Chastain from across the room. So what are people doing to causally link her expression to an antecedent event? And why are they so mistaken about what event she was reacting to? We could approach this as perceptual pattern matching. This assumes that the confirmation of others' faces and bodilies are inherently informative. Observers should be able to decode her experience from her multimodal expressions, and inferences observers make based on her expressions might be noisy, but should be accurate overall. But this seems to be a poor descriptor of observer behavior in this case. These assumptions do not explain why observers inferred that Nicole was appalled by a violent altercation rather than delighted to see her friend. While these reliable and confident errors are hard to explain through the lens of honest signal detection, I'm going to show you that this behavior naturally falls out of situating expressions in an intuitive theory of mind. In this view, which I'll call emotion reasoning, the interpretation of expressions is framed as causal inference over a mental model. Observers use this mental model to generate predictions about what emotions others are likely to experience in hypothetical events, and explain others' expressive behavior in terms of these emotion predictions. So this view asserts that in order to understand how people make sense of expressions, we need to model the role of forward predictions from context. To build a model of how people infer what event someone was reacting to, we made use of another televised show. Every episode of the British game show Golden Balls culminates with two contestants playing a public one-shot prisoner's dilemma. The two players each make a decision to cooperate or defect, and then simultaneously reveal their choices in front of a live studio audience, often with hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. I'm showing the payoff matrix on the left. If both players cooperate, they split the jackpot evenly. If one player defects and the other cooperates, then the defector takes the entire jackpot. And if both players defect, then they both get nothing. From the archival TV footage, we extracted 5-second videos of 88 players' expressions in the moments surrounding the climactic reveal, while masking which actions the players chose. Participants on MTurk viewed these videos and inferred which event each player was reacting to. Here's an example. Which of the 4 events do you think that she experienced? To infer what unseen event evoked her expression, we think the observers are reasoning over latent representations of emotion. So the simplified intuitive theory that I'm showing on the left here as a graphical model is that players' actions, which determine the outcome of the game, cause emotions, and emotions cause expressions. And this is an intuitive theory, so this is a scientific model of how we think observers are reasoning about players' emotions, not a scientific model of players' actual emotions. So for instance, if she attempted to cooperate but was betrayed by her opponent, people might predict that she would feel emotions like disappointed and embarrassed. If people then infer that she appears to feel disappointed and embarrassed based on her expression, people will guess that she was likely reacting to the CD event. And for this player, that would be correct. Here's a second example. Most people think that she and her opponent both cooperated and split the jackpot evenly. But the truth is that they both defected and both got nothing. So in this case, the idea is that the emotions this player appears to express violate most people's intuitions about what emotions the DD event will elicit. And this mismatch leads to systematic errors in observers' causal judgments. So reliable judgment errors like that are not isolated to a few observers or a few players. These box plots show how well observers classified players. But not particularly good at recovering which events players experienced. And when players were in fact reacting to DD games, the gray box plot, where both players defected and got nothing, observers were significantly below chance at inferring the correct event. This paradigm not only provides a ground truth metric of accuracy, but also allows us to examine the pattern of errors that people made. So this plot shows the proportion of judgments from each category of event and bars of a given color summed to 1. So for instance, when players were reacting to CD events, and blue up here, like the first example player you saw, observers guessed correctly about half the time. Whereas when players were reacting to DD games, like in the second example you saw, observers reliably and incorrectly inferred that players had cooperated with their opponents. So the task at hand is to build a model that can predict how humans causally reason about which event a player was reacting to and match this pattern of judgments. Going back to the intuitive theory, the central idea here is that people are reasoning over latent emotion representations. So to build a model of this causal reasoning, we collected 2 sets of emotion judgments. One group of observers was shown expression videos and judged what emotions the players were experiencing. For each of the 88 players, observers rated the intensity of 20 fine-grained emotions on continuous scales. For example, given the expression of this player, observers inferred that she was very disappointed, somewhat embarrassed and jealous, and definitely not joyful or relieved. An independent group of observers was told what events the players experienced, and without ever seeing the players' expressions, predicted what emotions the players would feel. Using these emotion distributions, we're going to simulate which event independent observers judged that the player was reacting to based on that player's dynamic expression. So these are the data that we're aiming to explain. And formally, the probability of observers guessing event A can be computed by marginalizing over emotions. We can use the causal structure of the intuitive theory and Bayes' rule to calculate the posterior probability of an event judgment given an expression. So the event is A, the expression is X. That expression video is X. We include a hyperprior, which amounts to the probability of the 4 event categories. This is estimated from metacognitive judgments about other observers' intuitive theory. So the model simulates event judgments for every expression video. And importantly, this model is parameter free at this point. So there's no training data involved here. Simply given these 2 emotion distributions, the attributions to spontaneous expressions and predictions from event descriptions, the model simulates how observers causally reason about which events evoked a player's expression, and we get a posterior probability of how many observers will infer that this expression was evoked by a given outcome. And from those simulated data, we can directly compare the event judgments of the model against those made by human observers. To give you an intuition of how this works, observers predict what emotions players are likely to experience in each of the 4 plausible events, and compare these predictions against the emotions that a player appears to experience based on that spontaneous expression video. By comparing the expression and event, observers infer the likelihood that the emotional expression was sampled from each of these prediction distributions, and infer the posterior probability of each event given that expression. This plot shows the posterior probabilities simulated by the model on the x-axis versus human judgments on the y. So for this player, most people thought she was reacting to the CD game. Some people thought it was a DD game, and very few people thought it was DC or CC. These are the 2 events in which she would have won money. These are the 2 events in which she would have gotten nothing. And these are the data for all 88 of the expression videos. And here are those data aggregated by which event the players actually experienced. The saturated bars show which outcomes human observers judged to be the causes of players' expressions. Desaturated bars show the outcome judgments simulated by the model. Solid bars indicate the correct judgments, and hatch bars the incorrect judgments. As you can see, outcome judgments simulated by this parameter-free model do an excellent job of predicting how human observers reason about which events evoked players' spontaneous expressions. So this model is wrong in the right ways. And by that, I mean it's wrong with respect to ground truth, but it's wrong in precisely the ways that humans are wrong. For example, the model predicts that observers will mistake the expressions of players in DD games for the expressions of players in CC games. So while it might seem counterintuitive that humans are systematically biased against the correct inference, it's exactly the pattern predicted by the emotion reasoning model. And we take this as evidence that humans make sense of expressions by reasoning over a hierarchical mental model of other minds to infer the best causal explanations for their observations. And this argues that modeling emotion predictions from context is crucial for modeling human emotion understanding. Indeed, if you ignore emotion predictions and try to model this causal reasoning behavior based on expressions alone, you do a very poor job of capturing observers' causal judgments. So in summary, observers are poor at using spontaneous expressions to recover what events players were reacting to. And by poor, I don't mean that their judgments were simply noisy. Rather, observers made systematic model-based reasoning errors. We presented a formal model of how observers use expression information to adjudicate between causal hypotheses generated by an intuitive theory of other minds. And by situating expressions in this mental model, a parameter-free Bayesian model can capture how humans reason about the event antecedents of others' spontaneous expressions. And so thank you to my amazing collaborators, Desmond Ong, Maggie Kuzumano, and Rebecca Sachs.
Thanks. That was a really fantastic talk. So one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I wonder if you could sort of shed light on it, is it seemed like in both cases, people were really bad at predicting the emotional expressions of the people who engaged in a pretty antisocial behavior. Like, I mean, which is funny to me because I think, if I think of someone like kind of cackling to themselves when they've just defected, like to me, that seems pretty intuitive. So why do you think people were so surprised by those expressions? Like, can you talk a little bit more sort of like, at least anecdotally, what kinds of other expressions happened and why don't people seem to associate them with that kind of behavior?
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. And I think where I'd like to start is just, if we think of, so you could think of that question as, why are people's actual reactions to these events so surprising, and why do people get that so wrong? Because often when you see those expressions while knowing the context of what happened, they seem totally natural. They don't seem surprising at all. And so the mental model that we're proposing is basically that there's a ton of background work that goes on into establishing the context of an expression that you see. And when you artificially segregate the perceptual component of an expression from all of that contextual information, you get evidence that that context is having a major impact on how you interpret the expressions that you perceive. And so in something like this, where it's clear that these are like the same color, whoops, but then you add context and they look totally different. I think that this is the type of work that the intuitive theory of what emotions people are likely to experience based on what we know about what events occurred and who they are and what they expected and what they achieved is changing how we subsequently interpret the perceptual component of their expression.
Yeah, makes total sense. Thanks.
Great talk. I really liked it. A sort of related question to the one that was just asked. part of what that suggests to me is like this observation that you see that video, you come up with this initial stereotype of like, oh, she definitely won. And then you give this additional piece of information. It's like, they both lost a ton of money on this, and she's sort of laughing. Like you can immediately come up with an explanation. Oh, she's like laughing in spite of that. Like it sort of suggests that the underlying distribution of like what situation or the distribution of what expressions could arise out of like that emotional event like has some variance, right? And like the surprisal is
and
not
maybe multimodality.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I was wondering if you had investigated those distributions.
Yeah,
and, like,
absolutely. You should check out a paper by Stefano Anzalati, Rebecca Sachs, and me about opaque representations of emotions in people's intuitive theory. And we do some modeling work on exactly that. Main take home point is that absolutely, I think that's exactly what's going on. Like you see a highly aroused face and everyone reliably judges it as negative. But when you see it in a tennis match and the body is doing this, it's like obviously positive. What's going on there is that people have a latent representation that includes peaks on both. This could be really negative or it could be really positive. But when you don't have any context, you just kind of report on the primary mode of that. But there's a second mode of that, which if you do really sophisticated psychology work to try and get people to report on, you can recover and show that it's there, but it's just not what people go to in the absence of context.
Okay, super cool. Yeah, thank you.
This was great, thanks. I also have a question about the errors in the negative case there. And so I'm wondering about two possible explanations and what you think, whether you think one of these would be more likely, and whether the model would have to change at all to account for this. So both kind of have to do with social display rules. In one case, you might think that people are failing to consider what would be appropriate to do if you've lost a lot of money in the context of a game show. Whereas in real life, you might say, you recognize that it's not a game. This is real money that you're potentially losing. You would be furious, and they would be right about that. And that might not be the case in the game show. It's not really appropriate to on TV when you're playing a game, when you've agreed mutually that you're playing a game, to then be furious at the person when those are the understood rules of the game. So that's one possibility. The other one is that, and I wonder, I don't know if this seems more likely to me or less likely, but it is a game show that's being televised. The producers are picking people who, you don't want to have people who are going to explode on live TV. It doesn't make for good TV, right? And so I wonder if it's like, if you told people not just how people would react, but how would they react in the context of a game show that's being televised on live TV, would that account for some additional variance?
Yeah, so the predictions that we collected, observers were given the full context of the game show, and they were shown an example negotiation between two of the players. And so we were effectively giving them as much information as we possibly could without actually showing them the reactions of two of the players in the game. So again, there's a number of facets of that. Maybe I'll just peel off one or two. Display rules are definitely part of what's going on and why the players are producing the expressive reactions that they are. Another thing that's certainly going on is that there's planning involved in the choices that the players made. And so someone who defects on this game show is probably treating defection differently than someone who cooperates. They've gamified the whole thing. And so when the other person defects on you, it's not like a moral betrayal. It was a game, and look, we both undercut each other. Whereas someone who cooperates, which is not in your financial interest, is probably doing something other than thinking about it as a purely rational choice. They've put weight on the pro-sociality and moral component. And so we've seen some evidence that what observers themselves what they think that they would do in a game like this changes what emotions they predict players will experience in the different outcomes.
So they probably would then be better at predicting if they were sort of fully simulating what those people, like you simulate what you would do, you go, oh yes, this makes more sense, like you'd be more accurate.
Yeah, so don't know about better or more accurate or any of those things, but certainly I think there's clear evidence that there's individual differences and how well people are able to do this, and future work I think should absolutely look at what components of the intuitive theory are causally involved in when people are better or worse at this. And so it could be like one hypothesis that it's purely mediated by perceptual acuity, that if you learn to notice the little micro expressions and the crow's feet and everything, that's what makes you better at recovering what events players were reacting to. Whereas the other idea that we're talking about is if you have a more accurate intuitive theory of how people are going to emotionally react and expressively produce in these events, then that could change whether you are better or worse at this thing, and that's future work. Yeah.
So there's an online question.
I think we're out of time. So if it's super fast, someone else could set up while I'm answering it.
Yeah, it says, to what extent are these priors cross-culturally universal?
Yeah, no idea. I've completely avoided the cultural question here. And the point of this work is that, look, in whatever sample I've collected, we're able to show that there's these computations occurring in how people accomplish this task, but certainly there's going to be some cultural differences, and I've just avoided that completely at this point.